Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com.
The educational ministry of Bethany Lutheran Church of Kerman, California supports this podcast through co-host Pastor Greg Camp. Church services are available on Zoom at www.bethanykerman.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another Scriptural Works podcast. I'm Patrick Spencer, one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined by Greg Camp, my other co-host. Greg, good to see you as always.
It's a wonderful, beautiful day here in Fresno.
Give it time. The summer's right around the corner.
Tomorrow.
Well, we're in for a real treat today. Greg, you want to introduce our audience to Cynthia?
Absolutely. We are very privileged to have with us Dr. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott. She's Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible Old Testament at the Department of Religion at Baylor University in the great Waco, Texas. It's a real pleasure to have her here as a fellow graduate from Sheffield University as well. But before she got to her PhD there, she did her Bachelor of Arts from Simpson University, Northern California, and her Master of Arts in Biblical Studies from Ashland Theological Seminary in Ohio, great place. And her PhD in Biblical Studies, where I finished mine, in history, historiography, archaeology of the Hebrew Bible. It's a lot of things you can do at Sheffield over in the United Kingdom. And her dissertation, which really caught our eye, is on home cooking, domestic food preparation in Iron Age 2 Judah. And she'll explain what Iron Age 2 is for us. Her research and her teaching focuses on household archaeology, fascinating area, in ancient Israelite and Judahite daily life, food in the Hebrew Bible and ancient Israel, gender and women in the ancient Near East, and 8th century BCE prophets. So this is part of our 8th century series. She's also authored Food in Ancient Judah, Domestic Cooking in the Time of the Hebrew Bible in 2013, which explores domestic food preparation practices in ancient Judah using household archaeology theory and spatial analysis. That was an enjoyable read when I went through it recently. That she co-edited T&T Clark's Handbook of Food in the Hebrew Bible and Ancient Israel in 2021 with Channeling Fu and Carol Myers, and contributed a chapter on the role of household in the religious feasting of ancient Israel and Judah. In addition to that, she's co-authored a brand new work called Grounded Theology in the Hebrew Bible. Just came out in 2025 with Elizabeth Blackfish, which bridges archaeology and biblical theology, examining how material culture and ancient Israelite studies illuminates biblical understanding. So she's currently serving on archaeological staff. It shouldn't come as a surprise given her background at Tel Halif and Tel Abel Beth Ma'aka in Israel, conducting field work on Iron Age households and domestic contexts. And so her scholarship, as you've picked up by now, focuses on material culture, archaeological evidence, but also integrating that with biblical interpretation to illuminate daily lives and social worlds of ordinary ancient Israelites. And for us today, particularly those of the 8th century BC prophets, Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, and Micah. So we get to see what life, as much as we can, was really like back then. Very excited to see.
Every time I talk to one of our new guests, Greg, I think I feel very humbled in many ways, because we have these long bios like Cynthia's of all this stuff.
My bio would take about 15 seconds, I think is all it would take.
Mine already passed. So, hey, Cynthia, I think you have a copy of your book. You want to hold it up so our audience can check it out for those who are looking at the video?
I sure can. This is my co-authored book that just came out in October. Can you hear me? With Libby Backfish. Yeah. And it's with Baker Academic. And the idea behind it was Libby's idea. So I got to give full props to Libby. So this was when we were at Jessup. I was previously at Jessup University in Rockland, California, before I came out to Baylor in 2022. And she's also a Hebrew Bible scholar, but she does more of the theology. And of course, I do more of the contextual side of things. And she said, there's just not a book that does both for our students. And she came up with this great idea. So we have about 10 different themes where the first half of the chapter, I look at all the historical, cultural, social context of that theme. And then she takes that and tries to help us understand Israel's theology of that particular theme better. So yeah, it's geared for undergrad, graduate students, interested lay readers. It really is a labor of love because we kept our students in mind as we were doing this.
Right. Nothing like teaching to produce really good works for teaching.
That's right. And the book I'm working on right now is on women in ancient Israel. And I teach a class on women in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And so, of course, I'm keeping my students in mind for that one, too.
That's great.
Yeah.
When's that one going to come out?
Oh, long time. Don't tell Erdmans, but I'm really behind. Really behind.
That sounds like a really fun. We'll need to have you back when you're close to publishing.
Oh, that'd be nice. Thank you. Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, if our audience isn't hungry, you're going to be, because we're going to talk about, as Greg alluded to, one of Cynthia's areas of specialization is food and festivals in ancient Israel. And we're focusing on the 8th century. So I'm really excited to dive into the details. Before we do so, we want to get a word from one of our sponsors. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. So, Cynthia, let's dive into the details. How, to start with, did you end up, because this seems a bit odd, how Old Testament scholar would get into this area of, studying food and households and festivals in ancient Israel?
Yeah, that's a great question, Patrick. I don't want to say it was an accident, but it kind of was. I'd always been fascinated with the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and in particular, daily life. Like, how did people live? I took a class as an undergraduate from one of my professors at Simpson. His name was Glenn Schaefer, no relation. And he taught a class on biblical backgrounds. And I just loved it. I just loved everything about it. And so the same professor is the one I went to Israel with for the first time as an undergraduate. And we did a dig for a day at the caves of Maresha, and we found absolutely nothing. But I do like to say I found my calling. And I've been digging ever since. And I just was thinking about, okay, how can I understand how your average ancient Israelite lived? And of course, I wanted to have some focus on women, but I didn't want it to be just about women. But I wanted to think about how they lived on a daily basis and how I could integrate, both the material culture and the textual material. And so I thought, okay, well, I was applying to PhD programs. And when I was applying to Sheffield, where I ended up doing my PhD, your writing sample had to be, at the time, it was your proposal, your research proposal. Now, of course, it wasn't something that you were absolutely married to. You could change your mind. But, and I just remember sitting at my kitchen table thinking about that and thinking, you know what, I don't know anybody who's done anything on food that wasn't related to the sacrificial system or to, at least in the Hebrew Bible, to feasting, or on the archaeological side of things, elite feasting again. And I thought that doesn't really tell us a lot about everyday life when you're just focusing on the special occasions. I mean, yes, those are important, even for your average Israelite, but I wanted to focus more on the day-to-day. And I didn't find anybody doing it. So now sometimes that can be great. Sometimes that just makes it even harder for actual dissertation. But luckily, a few people had done a little bit, and some people were doing some more work at that exact same time, like Nathan MacDonald's book on food. What did the ancient Israelites eat? He was working on that at the time. And so it was really nice to meet some other people who were working on food. We were all PhD students at the time. And so, yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And it really has helped me understand, as best as I can, how your average ancient Israelites lived. And I focused particularly on Judah for my dissertation, just because I had to narrow it down. And I wanted to focus on the Iron Age, and I did. But in particular, the Second Iron Age, when things are really, ramping up quite a bit, and there's more archaeological material as opposed to the Iron One period, at least at the time that I was doing that dissertation.
Interesting.
Right. Cynthia, in your work, you talk about focusing on household archaeology. How is that a subset of the broader field of archaeology, particularly biblical archaeology? And why does it matter? Why should we study this? You say that a lot of the work has been done on feasting and on these special occasions. What do you see happening in this household archaeology that opens a door for us a little bit more?
Oh, another great question. Wow, you guys did your homework. Well, household archaeology. So, if you think about archaeology as a discipline, and then within that discipline, there are lots of little specialities, things that you could focus on. And one is called landscape archaeology. And landscape, archaeology within it has now some subsets. And one of those subsets is household archaeology. And in fact, household archaeology may even be just its own now because it's become such a popular, discipline within the greater discipline of archaeology. And so what our household archaeology allows us to do is that is the stage where daily life occurs, is the house or household, as we say. And so if you really want to understand daily life of average ancient people, including what they raised, what crops did they grow, how did they store things, how did they prepare things into what kind of meals, even if you think about special occasions like feasting and weddings, if you really want to understand that daily life, we have to shift our attention from the big picture or the places of prestige, as Carol Myers calls it. And those places of prestige would be your battlefields, your palaces, your temples, the things that are text, whether it's Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, or other ancient Near Eastern texts. Those are the things that they focus on. And historically, in the archaeology of ancient Israel and Canaan, archaeologists have focused on those big monumental spaces, gates and temples and palaces and battles, and very little attention was given to that stage where daily life occurs, and that stage would be the house. And so for those of us that are interested in understanding how ancient people lived on a day-to-day basis, we need to focus more on those houses as opposed to those places of prestige. And so focusing on that and then doing what we call like a spatial analysis within a house. So that means you're not just interested in the architecture of the house. You are interested in that, but you're interested in how the space was used. And so you look at this relationship of that space to the artifacts that were left behind, and you try to determine areas of activity in the house. So let's say we excavated a house, and that house, we find the remains of an oven, and near it, we find the remains of cooking pots. And then we also find some organic residue. Well, that space, if we look at the spatial relationship of all those things that we've uncovered, and look at that and say, okay, this is where they are in relationship to the house. This is where they are in relationship to this wall, to each other, to other artifacts. We can determine that one of the area activities that happened in this area was food preparation. Now, that's a pretty obvious example, but it's a good one. So trying to determine, what these houses looked like, what artifacts are left behind, what can that tell us about what daily activities occurred in those spaces?
That's interesting.
Yeah, when I take students to Laodicea every few years, so one of the Greek Roman areas in Western Turkey, there's wonderful work that's being done there every year with temples and porticos and all kinds of things with the theaters. And then they just kind of wave their hand to the broad expanse and say, well, that's where people lived. And we're not doing anything out there. And it's like, but I want to know how people live.
Yeah.
And you're not showing me anything.
Mm-hmm. And that's just basically been the history up until somewhat recently of what people call biblical archaeology is the same thing. And I think most archaeologies, regardless of where they're focused on and what time periods they're focused on, I think that's been primarily the case. But thank goodness, within the last maybe 15, 20 years, there's been a real push to understand the houses and the households and the people who live there and work there.
Now, when we look at food specifically, how do we use that to, I think our audience probably wonder, why are we talking about food? How does this relate to the 8th century prophets? How do you use that as a frame for interpreting some of the passages that we find in those prophets? Cynthia, give us an introduction.
Sure. Yeah. So when we're looking at houses during the Iron Age, so even going into the 8th century Iron Age there, we pay attention, just like any time period we would. Okay, what does the house look like? Do a spatial analysis of the artifacts within the house. And we, of course, find a lot of artifacts that relate to the storage of food, the preparation of food, the consumption of food. And so, of course, food was probably one of the main activities of daily life, just like it is today. We go grocery shopping, we prepare food, we cook food, we clean up after food. We're always doing something related to food. And so if you think about most of the average ancient Israelites and Judahites, because if we're talking 8th century, we have the two different kingdoms at this point, their daily life centered around food as well. But of course, they were agro-pastoralists. They're farmers. They're more deeply connected to the land than we are. I didn't grow up on a farm. I don't live on a farm now. I'm sure if I did, I'd have a much better perspective about what I actually study. but I don't. So I'll do the best I can with what I have. But we're so disconnected from our food today. And your average ancient Israelites would not have been. So their lives would have revolved around the seasons, the agricultural calendar, if you will, which also ends up being the religious calendar as well. And so daily life centered around that. And if you take in the topography and the climate and the environment, things that you have very little control over as a person. But of course, ancient peoples thought their gods did. So there's a lot of that involved with those relationships. But that if you think about in ancient Israel, it's very similar to California. California is said to have a Mediterranean type climate. And being a former Californian myself, I'm very aware, and of course now in Texas where it's the same, of drought. And so if your daily life is dependent upon survival, and the survival of your household is dependent upon the fertility of your land, the fertility of your animals, the fertility of your people in your household. And so when we talk about households and food, we get a much better picture of what daily life would have looked like for your ancient Israelites and Judahites in the 8th century. So the house I excavated at Tel Halif was an 8th century house, but it was in Judah. So Halif is in the south. And so we excavated, a typical, what some people might call a 4-room Israelite house, but those of us that study households don't call it that. Because most of the houses, they don't have 4 rooms. So you can't say they're 4-roomed. And you don't know if they're Israelite or not. There's no way to know. So so an Iron Age house, or Oded Borowski calls it a pillared dwelling, because they all had pillars, either stone or wood with stone bases. So we excavated this house that was destroyed by Sennacherib's campaign in 701 BCE. And the Assyrians set fire to everything that they went through. And so once we got through the destruction of that house, then we were then on the first, which that destruction sealed that first floor of the house. And the first floor was as they left it, albeit on the eve of destruction.
Wow.
That sounds like a book, On the Eve of Destruction.
You know what? That's a great book title.
So can you describe a little bit more of what these houses look like? You said, a typical 4-room house or a pillar house. Is that really what they look like? Or what do they physically, what's the normal shape that they take, if there is a norm?
There is. And this style of house, when they first started studying these houses, back in the early 80s, they thought they all had 4 rooms, which is why they called them the 4-room house. But as more were excavated, they realized, oh, wait a minute, they're not just 4 rooms, but they do have a very typical pattern, a blueprint, if you will. So imagine a rectangular room, and that room, the door would have been on the short side of the house. And you walk in, and you would have, let's just go with 4 just to make it easy, right? So you would have 3 long rooms right next to each other, one after the other. But in the back of the house, running perpendicular to those long rooms, would be a room that ran the width of the house. So we call that the broad room. And these long rooms, the central long room was often the main, and not always, again, it depends on the needs of the people that lived and worked there, because these spaces could change. So you could, have a sidelong room and say, hey, we're going to put up this temporary wall, making it a sidelong room into 2 rooms. But you would always have one space that would have the remains of an oven. And then typically these houses would have rooms on the first floor would be used for a lot of household tasks, including food storage, food preparation, animal storage. So when we think about, small herd animals, you think about most households wouldn't have large herds. They would have small of sheep and goats, and they would likely bring them inside at night into one of these these side rooms, again, depending on the herd size. And then the second floor of the house would be primarily where the household members would sleep, maybe do some light household tasks. The roof of the house would have been flat. If you remember the story of Rahab's house in Joshua, where she hides the 2 spies on the roof of her house, she's drying flax up there, and that's because the roofs are normally flat. If you go to Israel today, you'll see a lot of that similar thing with flat roofs. Yeah. And then a lot of times these houses would have a courtyard. Now, there's some debate by some scholars and archaeologists as to whether that central long room on the bottom floor of the house, if it was open or closed. So was it a courtyard type space or not? Now, in earlier and later periods, they did have a courtyard type space in the middle of the house, but I'm not entirely convinced with these houses in the Iron Age, because when we excavate them, we find remains from the top floor collapsed onto the bottom floor. But I do think that they had some sort of what we would call a forecourt. So that would be a courtyard, but in front of the house. And those were oftentimes a shared outdoor space with the houses around them. And if you think about, how hot it can be in the dry summer months in Mediterranean type climates, if you don't have air conditioning, which of course they wouldn't, you're not going to want to do household tasks inside. You're going to want to do them outside. So your courtyard space, whether it was in front of the house or inside the house, was just as much of an important living room type space as any room inside the house. And you often find the remains of ovens or hearths there too, middens or like garbage piles, garbage pits, I should say. So they're pretty basic looking houses, and you would have pillars that separated the space on the bottom floor and to support the second floor. Another reason why I do think there was a second floor. And so if you're in an area where you have a lot of stone, those pillars might be made of stone. Or if you're in an area that doesn't, they'd be made of wood with stone bases, column bases. But they would not have been very large. Of course, they would range in size. They're not all exactly the same size, but they're not large houses. And if you think about the types of generational family members that would have been household members, it's a small space for a fair number of people. And there's no real such thing as privacy. This is not something that they that they would have been accustomed to, unlike us to today. So pretty basic utilitarian, focusing on agropastoralism, making food, prepping food, trying to store enough food for the next year to last you the year to be able to use those seeds for planting. Right. Yeah, it would have been a tough life.
Yeah. So who you mentioned that it wouldn't just be a nuclear family. Who all would probably be there?
Yeah, I think and that's the reason why we use the term household instead of family, because it would have been a multi-generational family plus. So the multi-generational family would be your patriarch and matriarch, who would have been the authorities of the family, and their unmarried children, both daughters and sons. If their sons were married, that would include their families as well, their wives and their children. If they happen to have more than one wife, that would include them and their children as well. It would also include people who aren't related to you, such as slaves and guests. And let's say you have hired workers. Maybe they're just workers for the season, or maybe they're workers for you full time. Maybe they live at the house, or maybe they live at their own house and come to your land to work. So when we say households could mean families it could also, it's usually, what we define a household as people who live and or work together on the family land.
Right.
Wow. Next time we complain about our houses being too crowded.
Yes.
Yeah, we have the family here for the holidays, and we have a large house, and it's pretty full. And we do spend most of our time in food preparation.
Right. Cooking, getting ready to cook, eating, and cleaning up.
Yep. So speaking of that, what kind of food did they typically eat, Cynthia? What's the normal diet? Was it varied? Was it the same thing day after day? What was it?
Well, I think that depends on a few factors. I think it depends on if it's a good year or a bad year as far as your crops and herds go. Again, your ancient Israelite and Judahite would be battling pestilence, drought, or too much rain, kind of like you're all getting right now. People who are damaging your crops, or warfare, all sorts of issues. So if everything is good, you of course have a lot of cereals. You have things made out of those cereals like bread, cakes, dumplings. You would also, you could roast the grain. You can eat that just kind of raw. You can make a porridge out of it. And then, of course, you have your fruits and your vegetables. We don't get a lot of mention of vegetables in the biblical text because it was not something that you get a lot of mention of meat, although they didn't eat meat as often as we do today. Now, I don't want to give the impression that they never ate meat, especially on special occasions they did. But you're dependent upon your animals for their secondary products. You need their milk. You need their their fleece. You need their dung that you dry to make fuel, cakes. You make dairy products out of their milk. So you don't just go and butcher an animal just because you have a hankering for lamb chops. I mean, you have a reason for doing it, right? Usually it's a special occasion, or maybe you needed to cull the herd. Maybe your herd's doing really well and you need to cull it. Maybe there's an agricultural or religious festival. Maybe there's a wedding. Maybe there's hospitality. So they didn't eat meat as much as we carnivores, if you're a carnivore, do today. But it was also something we need to keep in mind. They're dependent upon their animals. So they're not just going to go and butcher them for no good reason. But then also you have things like, as far as mentioned of vegetables, seasonal fruits and vegetables, you can't really store that for very long. I mean, you could dry garlic and fruit. Fruit trees would consist of, you've got pomegranates, you've got fig trees, you've got sycamore trees, you've got grape vines. But one of the things that people don't spend a lot of time on thinking about is the legume, the mighty legume. The legume and its pulse, or the inside, the seed within the pod. Those were pretty important to ancient people living in the land of ancient Israel and Canaan. And because they were inexpensive, they grew really well. And the thing about the roots of a legume plant is that they put nitrogen back in the soil. So a lot of ancient people would rotate their field. So they might have cereals in the field one year, and then the next year put legumes in that same field, and so that you're putting back nitrogen back into the soil. And so legumes would have been easy to store. They also would have gone really far as preparing them. If you've ever made lentil soup or something like that, you know that a little bit of lentils goes a long way. And so lentils would have been something that you would make stews out of. And I think breakfast would have been, kind of whatever, maybe some yogurt, because you would milk your animals usually in the morning, and then again at dusk. You would usually milk them twice. So you would have dairy product, and of course the dairy products don't keep. So if you don't make it into something that could keep, so you would have maybe some dairy products, some bread for breakfast, porridge if you have some grains that could be used that way, and then lunch. You're typically thinking about, you're out and about doing household chores. You're herding your flock, you're tending to your grapevines, you're tending to your orchards. And so lunch would have been something that you could take with you, likely. And dinner time, we think, is probably some sort of stew. A stew made of lentils, maybe some vegetables. If you have any meat that needs to be used, because remember, if you do butcher an animal, nothing goes to waste. You use the whole thing.
Everything.
Yeah, you use everything. And so if you, and that might be one reason why a household might not butcher an animal, because, maybe they don't have enough people to eat the whole thing, or maybe they might share it with their neighbor. Or if you're having a big, special occasion, why you might roast an animal in such a way. But of course you could smoke it, and that would preserve it for a bit longer as well. But yeah, so it's very simple, kind of based on the seasons, based on what could be grown, what could be stored. Very nice, what people call the Mediterranean diet today, which, is always a popular diet. And wine, don't forget wine and beer. Well, if you think about it, water, unless you got it from a fresh running source, wasn't the safest thing to drink.
You didn't drink it.
Yeah.
So the fermentation from wine and beer would have been safer for you to drink.
Yeah. And those grapes can give you wine or raisins, as we do so much in this area. So why do the prophets not mention so many of these things, particularly the 8th century prophets? They talk mostly about the wine, the oil, and the grain, but not about, who talks about legumes?
Well, legumes just aren't sexy, are they?
Well, the prophets didn't think so.
Apparently not. Well, I think when you think of that land and you think about the crops that are the main crops, you think of the grapevine, you think of the pomegranate, the fig tree, the grain, and you think of the olives for olive oil. Now, they didn't start eating olives until really the late Hellenistic, early Roman period. They didn't figure out how to brine them until then. So olives were strictly used for their oil. But olive oil was, it was used for so many things. It was used for medicinal use. It was used for cooking. It was used for, cultic rituals. It was used for all sorts of things. So it was a pretty important crop, that olive tree. And olive trees, like a vine, it takes a while for them to get established. It takes about 5 years for them to be fully established. And once they are established, they do really well. And olive trees are amazing. They're drought resistant. They don't need a whole lot. At my house in California, before I moved, we lived on an old olive orchard and we had olive trees that were over 100 years old, and they were still producing. Yep. They were so messy, but they were great.
Very much.
So when you think about those things that your average, all Israelites would have had access to in one form or another, that they were used to having access to, that would be part of their daily life. You would think of olive oil, you'd think of grains, you would think of wine being made out of the vineyard. So yeah, you very rarely get vegetables mentioned. In fact, some of the only time vegetables are mentioned are when in Exodus, when they're coming out of Egypt and they're saying what they miss. They talk about leeks and garlic and melons. You get that mention in 2 Kings, I think, of the gourds that end up poisoning the prophets. Yeah, I think it's 2 Kings or 1 Kings. And so those products, though, when you think about the Mediterranean triad, you think of grains, you think of olives, you think of grapevines.
Interesting.
Do those things also
throw gourds at each other? So we weren't eating them.
So does that triad also form a basis for broader commercial enterprise? Is that something that can be stored? So I was told by students, of course, whether I knew it or not, that you can store those things and you can ship those things for international commerce. You can't with vegetables, although you could with legumes, I suppose.
You could with legumes, right? But vegetables, no. Those are purely seasonal. You have a better chance of drying fruit, so those last a little bit longer. But Israel was known for their olive oil, and they were known for their wine. And so you could export those for trade to places like, if you think about Mesopotamia, if you think about Assyria and Babylon, they grew more, they had more sesame oil than olive oil, and they had more beer, I think, than wine. It's not that they didn't have those things, but one of the reasons why the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Neo-Assyrian Empire didn't take everybody out of the land of Israel when they conquered and destroyed those, vassal kingdoms of Israel and Judah. They wanted the people to still work the land, because they could not get the goodness of the land if there weren't people there to work it. And so we have, there's plenty evidence of trade all across the Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern world with Israel and Judah, particularly those products, really well known for their olive oil and their wine.
Yeah. Now you've written about, the feasting and famine, two juxtaposed concepts, if you may, or should be, or theoretically are anyway. I think in your TNT handbook Clark handbook that Greg referenced, can you talk a bit about those two concepts and how they parallel each other?
Sure. Yeah. The TNT Clark Handbook of Food is really the first of its kind when it's related to ancient Israel and the Hebrew Bible. And we have a number of amazing scholars involved in that project who have written on all sorts of subjects. And Peter Altman wrote on the famine chapter, and Rebecca Welton wrote on the too much of food and drink. So we have that juxtaposed there with that. And I mean, famine, you have to imagine, we talk about drought today and how different parts of the country seem to always be in some drought or another. But that doesn't directly impact us as it would have with ancient Israelites. Their livelihood was based on the land. And so if there was a famine, that meant your survival was in jeopardy. That you and your household, if you were just an average ancient Israelite, which most people were, and most people lived in rural villages, hamlets, and farmsteads, that they're tied to the land. Their very survival is tied to the fertility of their land, their animals, and their people. And if any one of those things suffers, then the entire household suffers. Whereas opposed to the feasting part, especially when we get here into the 8th century, when even though they're under the thumb of the Neo-Assyrians, you still have, according to those 8th century prophets, you still have this growing elite upper class, especially in the northern kingdom of Israel, because Israel at that point in the north, their economy is much stronger than the kingdom of Judah. In particular, because of their climate and their topography. I mean, Israel, again, is very much like California, which doesn't mean anything to my students in Texas. However, you get a lot more rain in the north of California than you do in the south. And you have a lot more rivers, you've got a lot more rain, you've got better agricultural lands. And so the northern kingdom of Israel did much better economically. Of course, they did very poorly politically, but they did much better economically than their neighbor in the south of the kingdom of Judah, primarily because of those conditions. So when you think about the opposite side of when things are going really well, you think, well, okay, your average person would probably be doing better as well. However, when your elite communities are taking advantage of your average everyday person, and maybe the elite communities aren't, Israel never really had a huge upper class per se, right? So mostly working class. But in that 8th century, according to our prophets of the 8th century, you have this kind of growing, albeit, still small by our standards, middle class to upper middle class. And so those 8th century prophets are really getting on the case of your elite people in those communities, saying, you think you're being blessed because you're going through all the right motions, religious motions. You think you're being blessed because of that, and that you're doing really well, and that you're feasting and idle luxury. However, that's happening because you're taking advantage of the poor within your own communities.
Yeah.
And that's when you have people who, say, if you're an ancient Israelite farmer, family, household, and you're not surviving. And so you might have to go to extreme steps to order to have some of the household survive. So maybe you sell a child into slavery. Maybe you sell yourself into slavery for a temporary amount of time. Or maybe worse upon worse, you sell the family land. That family land that's been in your family for generations, which is just as much part of your household as any person is. And so once you lose that land, you no longer have the means to provide for yourself and your household and your future generations. And so if what we end up seeing is people selling their land, and the people who buy that land end up becoming their landlords, and they become tenant farmers on that land, and that rent for those tenant farmers ends up being something that they just can't manage in the long term. And so when you see people going to extreme measures, and that's when our 8th century prophets come in and go, wait a minute, you're supposed to love God and love others. If that's the core of the covenant, you think you're being blessed, it kind of directly contradicts that so-called Deuteronomistic theology of you obey the commandments, you're blessed. If you disobey, there's consequences. But the 8th century prophets are saying, no, you got this all wrong. You're not being blessed. You're gaining financially because you're not loving others. In fact, you're taking advantage of others.
Yeah. Well, Cynthia, let's turn to one specific 8th century prophet, Amos, who I have an affinity for.
Me too.
If you, maybe because I'm from California, and he says he's a shepherd and a figure of sycamores.
Yes, a piercer
I'm no
of sycamores.
prophet. I'm no son of a prophet. It almost sounds like a swear word. If you read Amos as, we'll call him a food archaeologist, you're trying to figure out what's happening, what jumps out at you from what he's describing there? Because he uses a lot of food language.
He does. And the thing I tell my students a lot is you write to the people, to the audience that you're speaking to, right? So if he's any good pastor or any good writer, any illustrations you use, you're going to try to have them be relevant to the audience you're speaking to. And of course, Amos, out of all the prophets, I think he uses probably some of the most agricultural imagery involved. And he uses that agricultural imagery because everyone are agriculturalists. They're agro-pastoralists. So he's speaking their language. Not only is he one, but so is everyone else. Even your elite people would be agro-pastoralists, although they might have hired a lot of workers, as well to do a lot of that. So when he talks about all this, uses all this imagery, he's speaking their language, and he's speaking not only as a way to be relevant to them, but saying, I know that this is what we're all dealing with. We're all have to survive off the land here. And this is in talking about all that beautiful imagery of the land and the products of the land and the animals and whatnot. But he can address that because, of course, he's an agro-pastoralist, but so is everyone else, right? So he's using that language, that imagery, to connect with the people that he's speaking to. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the economics of it, for sure. Yeah, the household economics. Every person is a productive member, hopefully productive member of their household economy. Mm-hmm. And if one person is not producing, whether deliberately, or maybe they've just given birth, or maybe there's been an accident, or they've been sold into slavery. I mean, each person that's not there helping to the household produce is really putting the household economy in jeopardy.
Yeah. This, building on the Amos connection, Cynthia, there's this passage in Amos 8 that talks about merchants making the ephah small and the shekel great. How does your work help us better understand what this means?
Right. So they're basically taking advantage of the scales, and they're taking advantage. I mean, there's no currency at this point, right? So currency doesn't really come into existence.
No gold standard. No.
Right. There's no coins yet. That doesn't really happen until the Persian period. So a couple, time periods later. So when you're talking about just the weights of actual measurements, you're making things heavier or lighter. So when you're bartering, you're actually the person who's actually trying to do the selling, or I guess you could say the buying as well, but the person who is taking advantage of your average everyday person, because there's no, like you said, there's no gold standard yet. There's no systematic measurement as of yet. And so you have people taking advantage in the economic system using those weights and scales. They're just being jerks. That's my
sound like Amos.
My professional.
Yeah, some of it's hard to take. Are these just corrupt people, or have they gamed the system in a way so that the system is very legal and legitimate, but they've learned to manipulate it based on they've rigged the system. Yeah, which is a different form of
I would
corruption.
say so. I don't know if you know Roger Naum. Roger Naum is at Emory, and he does a lot of economy work. A lot of later economy work with Ezra and Nehemiah, but also he does, the economics. His dissertation was on the economics and kings. And so, he would say that people are taking advantage of the system Yeah.
Right.
And further causing grief for your average everyday person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, Amos, like the other 8th century prophets, really goes hard after the feasting. They're as they lounging on couches and
Yeah.
bowls of wine,
Uh-huh.
anointing oils. I mean, it sounds like they're watching football on the weekend and having big parties and whatever the heck they did. But he really plays this up. Is feasting really that common? Is it something that happens in the households? Is it something that happens primarily in the temples? You get this exaggerated language. So where is it really located?
Right. So feasting would occur in households for sure.
Okay.
So because if you think about the agricultural calendar and the liturgical calendar are connected. So liturgical calendar being like if the worship calendar. So if you think about the Jewish liturgical calendar, you've got the main high holy days of Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and those are all religious holidays, but they are also they started out as agricultural holidays, and they retain that part of their identity, but they add the religious element to it as well. And so when you think about feasting is a special occasion, and special occasions would happen in households throughout the year. Now, it could be a religious agricultural festival. So let's say Shavuot, which is, in the New Testament, it's called Pentecost. It is 50 days after Passover. It's an agricultural holiday that celebrates the ingathering of the wheat and barley, most commonly talked about, referenced or connected with the book of Ruth, I should say. So you have that part of the feasting calendar, but then you also have special occasions like weddings and hospitality. You have hospitality feasting as well. And you would have, and sometimes there's some, if you think about the story of when David doesn't come to King David, this is in 1 Samuel, King David doesn't come to Saul's new moon feast. That's when he and Jonathan try to do that trick to figure out, if Saul's still after him. Right. And so the new moon feast, some might even say a Shabbat type of feast once a week on Sabbath. But now that's, a bit debatable, I think, that one. But you have household feasting occurring. It's not just occurring in a temple or a palace. Everyone likes a party, special occasion. And so you would, that's when you would butcher an animal and you would roast it, and you might offer, and the animal would likely first be a sacrifice, and then it's roasted and eaten by the whole community. You'd have an abundance of food and drink. There's usually a special occasion involved. It's not just feasting for the sake of feasting. And it's not, feasting as far as kings, because kings would feast a lot more than your average person because they're being it's political feasting, right? You're having, different emissaries from all over the ancient Near East coming and going. And so you might have a feast for that type of reason. You think most prominently of the book of Esther, all the feasting that's in Esther. You have the feast that's talking about King Solomon's table and how abundant that was. And so that's like its own thing. But feasting on a daily household level, is a thing. But when we think about Amos talking about feasting, he's not really connecting it to special occasions, right? I mean, if my recollection goes, he's not connecting it with a certain holiday. They're just feasting, right? And so one that shows
overabundance and
it's
opulence.
over. Yeah, it's showing that these people have way more than enough, and that they have so much that they can feast whenever they want, and that they're kind of showing off. They're using their feasting to show off.
Interesting.
But if you have an ivory couch, that means you've bartered something somewhere on the international market where you could import this very expensive product, which is probably somebody else's food stuff that you've been able to sell.
Right. And you're feasting an idle luxury while people, and it's not even talking about, the other, it's talking about your own community. Your own community is suffering, and you're taking advantage of it, and you're feasting while they're suffering.
Yeah. Cynthia, drawing on that, when you look at Amos 5, which, Amos says, God hates your festivals and your assemblies. I hate your feast. I assume that's what the connotation is here. It's impugning them for their overabundance and their opulence and their disregard for those who are around them who are suffering and who are going hungry.
Right. But even if you, in that particular passage, when you connect it to actual religious cultic festivals that are going on, which are supposed to be, in a way connected with their relationship with God, and God's saying, no, this is not working. You think this is helping, but it's not. You're actually, I don't want this. Because part of in that world, part of what you would do, your temple is considered a house to that God that you've built it for, and that your cultic personnel, they're supposed to take care of that God. So you're supposed to feed it, give it drinks, and the feeding would be the sacrifices, right? So sacrifices are a meal, as Mary Douglas, talked about. The feast, the sacrifice is a feast between you and your God, and that feasting is a way to bond you and your deity. But if you're not doing the other things you're supposed to be doing, so if you're supposed to love God and love others, they're not mutually exclusive, they're intertwined. So you love God through the loving of others. And so if your God sees that, oh, you're loving me by giving me these religious rituals and these feasts, and you're doing all these fun things, but at the same time you're taking advantage of the poor in your community and you're feasting off of their backs. So God's saying, no, that it doesn't work that way.
Cynthia, you have to pardon the puns. Grandpa has to tell the puns here. But Amos is a particularly delicious book when it comes to food issues. Is there a particular succulent passage? There's two that you would want preachers and teachers to go back to?
Well, I think the one that Patrick just mentioned, where he's getting on their case about their religious rituals and how empty they are. As far as you're talking about food and feasting, that's a perfect one.
Interesting.
What about you, Greg?
Well, I think about this. I'm pastoring a very small church in a small farming community outside of Fresno. And this little congregation has been very active in food distribution. And we have, there's like 20 people in this congregation, and they'll have 200 people show up at a food giveaway.
Wow.
In cooperation with some of the food banks locally. And so literally giving food to people, even if all we're doing is handing it out, we're not providing it, is such a meaningful activity that we have to realize that this is a basic place where people live, in the sense that we need food. And we can't be taking it literally out of people's mouths. We need to be handing it to them.
Yeah. So, what would you say, Patrick?
No, that's a good question. I think the texts that talk about making the ephah small and the shekel great, the corruption or the inequity, the weighting of the standards in rural America today, that rings true loudly, right? Because we're seeing large corporate farms, they've already largely, no pun intended there, have taken over large parts of rural America. And it's just not the farm, the farm corporations, but it's even the small retailers. And that's something that I think that attracted both Greg and me to these 8th century prophets. It's a real problem today when you flip it on its head. And when you have these large entities that control, agribusiness, if you may, or these real entities, there's a disconcern that arises for the people in those communities. And it's a real problem today, as well as back in 8th century Israel.
You can't read the 8th century prophets without feeling convicted, I don't think.
Very true. Yeah, very true.
Well, there's an entire
we have about
economic
15
system.
minutes left, Greg. We better spend some time on something other than Amos, I think.
What else is there?
I do love Amos.
This is funny.
I do love him.
Well, how about Hosea? Hosea does use food and agriculture. We focus in on his wife quite often when we read Hosea, but there's other aspects obviously to that text than just Hosea's wife. How does that ring true? What elements of food play out in the book of Hosea?
Yeah, I haven't done a whole lot of looking into Hosea other than I do more of the looking at the kind of religious ritual part, or at least the worshiping of other gods part. So when you think about, when I think of Hosea, and of course you think of that the metaphor of the relationships, right? So you have both the metaphor of the father-son relationship and the metaphor of, Hosea's relationship with Gomer. And the thing that I emphasize with my students on that one, because I haven't had a food class yet. I mean, we talk about food in different classes in different ways, but so I talk a lot with them about the reality of ancient Israelites, how they worshiped Yahweh right? So when we think about what they actually did versus what a lot of people think that they did, I get a lot of times where people say, well, Israel worshiped God alone and they were really good at doing it. And I think, have you read the Old Testament at all? Because every single book talks about how they did that very, very poorly. And how archaeologically on a household level, we find these figurines, which, our Hebrew Bible says, which some people would say that these would be the teraphim, the idols that, our biblical authors talk about. And so when we talk about, food related to cultic ritual, part of the offering of food, or the offering of food for sacrifices, is you're taking care of that deity that you're worshiping, and that you're trying to appease them to a certain degree in order that they bring the order out of chaos to your own society. And so when we excavate these houses, and I've found a number of figurines myself. Not only does the text tell us that they worshipped, they weren't very good at worshiping Yahweh alone, that they worshipped, sometimes they didn't worship Yahweh at all. Sometimes they worshipped, just these other deities. But a lot of times it was the syncretism of Yahweh and, so let's say Baal or Asherah. And so the reality of the situation, not just both in the text, but in the material culture, that we find these figurines, which a lot of archaeologists theorize that maybe that these figurines are indeed, the household idols for your average Israelite and Judahite that they had in their houses.
How large are these, just for the sake of our audience?
Yeah, they're not very big. They're usually about 3 to 6 inches. They're made out of clay. Oftentimes they're made out of a mold, and the two sides are put together. And so we sometimes, and a lot of times they're female figurines. We also find zoomorphic figurines, so animals. But when we talk about Hosea, and we talk about, talking about how Israel's relationship, that metaphor, Israel's covenant relationship with Yahweh is like a marriage, the marriage symbolically posed between Gomer and Hosea. And so when we talk about, that relationship, it's like, well, the reality is that they're committing adultery on their marriage by committing idolatry, and both the biblical texts and the archaeological record, show that. But as far as, I haven't done myself any research into food in Hosea though, so I'm really sorry to disappoint you. But what about you, Patrick? What do you think?
No, that's a good question. I don't know. I was curious to hear what you.
I disappointed you. I'm sorry.
No, there's so much to do in this area yet. So.
There really is.
Probably new field of study.
And particularly with Hosea, which is usually focused on the human relationship side rather than the food side.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll put that on my list of things to do.
That's your next article at SPL.
Well, famously in Isaiah in chapter 5, he likens Israel itself to a vineyard.
Yeah.
So you use a very different metaphor instead of the social one between husband, wife, or father, child. It's now a farmer to a vineyard, and he's terribly disappointed in the grapes that it's producing.
Yeah.
You talked about the destruction layer that you saw in the household. Is there any way to see that in like the vineyard area? I know it's a very different kind of archaeological space, but destruction to the agricultural spaces?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty well known that the Assyrians, since we're talking 8th century for the most part here, would set fire to everything in their path. However, they wanted Israel's wine. They wanted their olives. So there's a fine line between destroying something, but then not being able to have it. So if they really wanted that wine, and they wanted that olive oil, and they wanted that grains, they would have to, consider very carefully. Now, if you go to Israel today, you still see the terraces on the sides of the hills. They're pretty old terraces too. I couldn't quite say if they were Iron Age terraces or not, but they're pretty old terraces. And the fact that, you have such a small space, Israel's so hilly, and you have such a small space that you have to, and it's very rocky. You have to clear all those rocks. You have to make the terraces. You have to keep up with the terraces. You have to, and then you have that limited space to grow all your orchards and grow your crops and whatnot. But as far as, the destruction of vineyards, I haven't seen any myself. And when I think of what I know of the Neo-Assyrians and wanting, the wine and the olive oil, I don't think they would have really done that very much. That's my guess.
So more selective destruction, perhaps.
Yeah, because Sennacherib's prism talks about how he destroyed 48 towns and villages in Judah alone. So after the destruction of the north in 722, 721, and he goes south, or Sennacherib then goes south in 701, and destroys just that many towns and villages in Judah alone. That's a ton. Right. And so not all of them are walled cities like Halif or Lachish. But most of the agricultural parts would have been outside those city walls. So those cities would have been destroyed, but not necessarily their fields, because they would have wanted for themselves at that moment, and then also to trade later.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of your book, we got to talk about the theological components of this before we wrap up the podcast for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
From your perspective, how does putting food and households at the center, based on, if we read these prophets correctly, right, at the center of the universe, change the way we think about these prophets? When we read them, what theological repercussions does that have for us?
Yeah, I think it does, because when we read the Hebrew Bible, we're reading it from the perspective of the people who wrote it, right? And the people who wrote it were interested in big monumental things that connect with Israel's history and their relationship with their God. So they focus on prophets and priests and kings and battles. They don't focus a lot on the daily life. We get snippets of it, but remember, they're not writing to us, so they don't explain things like they would be explaining to someone who wasn't part of their history and culture. So we have to, we have to do some research. We have to do some excavating. We have to figure out, okay, what are they not telling us? And so when you think about, the daily life aspect, the households and the food, and especially you see from these 8th century prophets, you see that, people's survival, your average person's survival, was of concern to God. And that this was not something, it wasn't just, hey, worship me and give me big, grand celebrations and feasts and all this stuff, but it's about the daily life, and if you think about the Shema in Deuteronomy, right? So you're supposed to, you hear that first part, the hero, Israel, love the Lord your God, love the Lord alone. But then if you keep reading in that passage, it really highlights more of the daily life stuff, that the worship of Yahweh is not just in the big monumental cultic religious feasting. It's in the daily practices that you see in the daily lives of your average ancient Israelites and Judahites.
And their relationships with particularly those that are more disadvantaged than the elite.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, those are great perspectives to bring to reading the text, to try to read it from the voice that's not there.
Yes.
The average person. Are there some techniques that you would suggest or resources that people could turn to help develop this sense? That's
a great question. So
besides your own books, of course.
Besides my own book, yes. So there's a number of things out there that are doing that have done. So Philip King's and Larry Stager's book, Life in Biblical Israel, it's outdated but it was published in, I think, 2000, 2001, but it's a beautiful book. It's beautiful pictures. It's really well done. But it is really the thing that talks about, daily life. And it is geared towards, students and interested lay readers. It's not written for other scholars is what I mean by that. So that's a great book that I have found really helpful. Victor Matthews and Don C. Benjamin's book, The Social World of Ancient Israel. I love that book. What they do is they take a look at, the different roles within a village, or how they look at Israel as a village and then Israel as a state. So they'll talk about, the king and the prophets and the state part, and then the village part will be like fathers, daughters, midwives, things like that. So that's been really, really good. As far as when you're reading the text and you're thinking, I tell my students, first of all, read out loud. Read your biblical text out loud, because if we want to try to hear it the way the original audiences would have heard it, right? They wouldn't have read it, they would have heard it. And so, but then it also forces you to slow down when you read it out loud. And because especially many of us who are quite familiar with the Bible, and we skim things. And then now, of course, our attention spans are horrible. So we skim even more, but you miss things. And if you just ask some basic questions, which if you take any kind of hermeneutical interpretation class, they ask you who, what, when, where, why, to whom, some basic questions. And any kind of good study Bible too is really helpful. NIV has a really good cultural background study Bible. That one's really helpful. It focuses a lot on like the biblical background stuff. But then, Biblical Archaeology Review has a great magazine, and that's geared towards a general audience as well. Right. And you could always come on an excavation with me to Abel. You could learn how to excavate and see that, this is really tough work.
So actually, seriously, how do, if someone's interested, they should simply reach out to you?
Reach out to me, yeah. Find my Baylor webpage, my bio page, and shoot me an email. I'm digging at Abel Beit Ma'akah right now. I'm part of that team, which that is mentioned in the book of 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel 20, I believe, with the wise woman of Ma'akah. And that's where we're excavating right now. Wow. So Halif, we're in publishing phase, so we're done excavating there for right now. But
how far off are you from publishing on the
Halif stuff? Well, don't tell my director. I should be working on it right now. We're behind, of course. Academics are always behind.
What isn't always behind?
Yeah, but actually being part of a dig is hard work. But if you have the time and the energy to do it, it's a great experience, even if you just do it once.
Yeah. Great insights.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a thrill doing a deep dive on a topic. I don't think we've done it quite this way before, Greg, and it's been very enlightening.
Very much.
It's a pleasure to have a conversation with Cynthia today. We look forward to having her back. We're going to have to have her back on.
Absolutely.
I'd be happy to.
You heard a broad background, so this is a lot of fun.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you.
So for our audience, thanks for joining us as always. We encourage you to check out other Scriptural Works podcasts at scripturalworks.com. For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels. You can also find us on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Thanks a bunch.